The morning Douglas Mercer walked into Leona's clinic without knocking. She already knew what kind of conversation was coming. He never knocked. 12 years of occasional, carefully managed contact had taught her that much. Knocking would have required him to treat her like someone whose space deserved respect, and Douglas Mercer had never quite gotten there. He appeared in the doorway of her office in his Thursday suit, the one he wore to things that required looking important without being theatrical about it. He held a manila folder with the loose grip of a man who had already decided how this meeting would go and was simply here to deliver the conclusion. He looked at the wall behind her head. He almost never looked at her directly. Callista said no. He cleared his throat. The Harrington arrangement, the engagement, she won't go through with it. Leona set down her pen. She didn't turn around immediately. She watched him in the mirror mounted on the far wall of her office, the one she used to check her appearance before walking out to patients, and she read the specific quality of his discomfort, the way his jaw moved when he was saying something he knew was indefensible. Which means what exactly, she said. You're going in her place. 6 words. That was how long it took to end one version of her life, and though Douglas didn't understand this yet, begin something he hadn't planned for. Leona was 31 years old. She had a 6-year-old son named Otto who slept with a stuffed rabbit named Gerald and was learning to read at a level 2 grades above his class. She had a medical degree from Penn and 4 years of emergency medicine before she'd moved herself and Otto from Philadelphia to New York 3 years ago, not randomly, and not for any reason she'd explained to anyone. She'd moved here specifically, deliberately, with a plan she had not yet fully articulated even to herself. She was the daughter Douglas had never claimed. Her mother, Leona Voss, had been a private chef at the Mercer estate for 9 years. Beautiful, quiet, precise in the way of people who understood that their survival depended on making as few mistakes as possible. Theda had been careful enough that she'd lasted 9 years before Millicent Mercer decided that her husband's loyalty to the woman in the kitchen had become a problem worth solving. Leona had been 6 when she understood what her mother was to the Mercers, 7 when she understood what her mother was to Douglas specifically. She was 20 when Theda died. The official cause was listed as cardiac arrest secondary to medication error during a routine hospitalization at a facility whose board included 2 members of the Mercer Foundation's advisory committee. A wrong dosage, a tragic accident, a brief service attended by the kitchen staff, and exactly 1 person from the Mercer family who stood at the back with her hands folded and her expression professionally arranged and left before the flowers were placed. Millicent Mercer had left before the flowers were placed. If you have ever been handed over like a problem someone else didn't want to deal with, if you know what it feels like to be treated like the inconvenient version of a person rather than a person, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches, because what Leona does next, what she builds and what she takes back, and what she refuses to let stay buried, is not a story I want you to miss. She turned around on her office chair and looked at Douglas directly. He blinked. He always blinked when she met him head-on, as though direct eye contact from her still surprised him after all these years. "Wolfe Harrington," she said. "Yes. You want me to marry Wolfe Harrington because Callista decided her life was worth more than your business arrangement." Douglas set the folder on the edge of her desk. "There are contract provisions that would benefit you significantly. Resources, legal standing, security for you and the boy. Don't," her voice came out flat, "don't use Otto as a negotiating point." His jaw tightened. The Mercer Group's partnership with Harrington Holdings goes back 15 years. If we don't deliver on the terms of this agreement, the consequences affect the entire company. Jobs, contracts, ongoing. "And it's convenient," Leona said evenly, "that there happens to be a second daughter." The silence in the room was the particular kind that happened when something true was said to someone who didn't want to receive it. She opened the folder an hour after he left. She read every page twice. Wolfe Harrington, 36 years old. The Harrington Group held majority interests in commercial real estate, private equity, manufacturing operations, and a logistics company that moved goods in ways not always reflected in public filings. Everyone in New York knew what the Harrington name meant. It was a name that ended arguments, that resolved disputes before they became visible, that appeared in enough news coverage over the years to make clear the legitimate businesses were the surface of something considerably more complex. Callista had refused because she was smart enough to understand the weight of that name. Leona sat with the folder in her lap and thought about her mother's last letter. Theda had written it 3 weeks before she died. Leona had found it inside the lining of a coat she hadn't worn since she left Philadelphia. 4 pages, careful and deliberate, the writing of a woman who was afraid and pressing forward anyway. She thought about what a marriage to Wolfe Harrington would actually mean. Not for Callista, who had a trust fund and options and a life that could absorb a refusal. For Leona, who had a son and a plan she'd been patient about for 3 years, who needed a position strong enough to make certain people feel consequences they'd spent 12 years believing would never arrive. Douglas thought he was using her. He was sending her the way you sent something disposable into a gap where something useful had been removed. He had badly miscalculated what she intended to do with the opening. She picked up a pen. She found the signature line. She signed her name without hesitation, her hand completely steady. The car that came for her 4 days later was black and expensive. The driver introduced himself with only his last name, Court, and maintained, over the 45-minute drive to the Harrington estate, a professional silence so complete it felt almost like a skill. Leona spent the drive looking out the window and cataloging everything she could observe. Otto sat beside her with Gerald in his lap, drawing in a small notebook, occasionally looking up to show her something. "Is it a castle?" he asked, as the car turned down a private drive. "It's a house," she said. "A big house," he said, which was accurate. The Harrington estate was not a castle. It was a large stone structure set at the end of a long drive with the specific quality of permanence that came from old money applied toward a single purpose over several generations. The grounds were immaculate. The windows were deep set. The gate had opened before they reached it, which meant someone had been watching. A woman opened the front door before Leona had finished climbing the steps. She was perhaps 42, lean and precise in the way of someone who maintained physical capability as a form of discipline. Her dark hair was pinned back with a severity that looked like a statement. She looked at Leona and then, with a slight recalibration, at Otto standing beside her, holding Gerald by one ear. "You're the Mercer girl," she said, not a question. Leona said, "This is my son Otto." Otto looked at the woman with the direct, unself-conscious assessment of a 6-year-old. "Your house has a fountain," he said. "We drove past it." Something moved in the woman's expression, not warmth, but the involuntary response of someone who hadn't expected to be spoken to first by a child. "It does," she said. "Sybil Harrington, Wolfe's sister. I'll show you to your rooms." She turned and walked inside without waiting. Leona followed with Otto's hand in hers, filing away the specific positioning Sybil had taken on the steps, the way she'd looked at Otto as a secondary detail, the carefully arranged quality of her neutrality, which wasn't neutrality at all. It was assessment wearing neutrality's clothes. Wolfe Harrington was in the kitchen when she found him the following morning. She'd gone out at 5:30, while Otto was still sleeping, to walk the estate's perimeter. She needed to understand the physical geometry of a place she'd moved herself and her son into. She came in through the kitchen entrance and nearly walked directly into him. He was taller than the photographs had suggested. Standing at the counter with a coffee cup and his phone, he looked up when she came in with the unhurried attention of a man accustomed to being the first one up and unaccustomed to being met. He looked at her, then at the muddy hem of her coat. "You've been outside," he said, "since 5:30. Walking the property." "Yes." He set his phone down. "How much of it?" All of it. She held his gaze. I like to know where I am. Something shifted in his expression, very slight, in the region around his eyes. Not surprised exactly. More like the involuntary registration of something that interested him despite his intention to remain uninterested. Wolfe Harrington. He said it the way a person stated their name when they knew the other party already knew it, but wanted to establish the terms of a direct conversation. Leona Voss. He nodded once. Then he picked up his coffee and walked out of the kitchen, and she stood in the morning quiet after he left, listening to the house settle around her, and tried to name what she'd felt in those 30 seconds. Not fear. She'd expected something like fear. What she'd felt instead was the specific recognition of a person who operated from similar principles, just aimed in different directions. She would think about that later. The first thing Sybil did was the staff. Leona noticed it over the first week. The slight delay in responses, the rooms not quite ready when they should have been, the small logistical frictions that could each be explained as coincidence but accumulated into a pattern she recognized. Sybil was talking to the household staff, not ordering rudeness, nothing that documentable, but establishing through tone and implication that Leona was temporary, that investing professional attention in her was not worth the cost. She said nothing about it. Instead, she learned names. She paid attention to what individual people cared about. The housekeeper, Bev, whose mother had recently moved into assisted living. The groundskeeper with the bad shoulder he never mentioned, but favored when the weather changed. A young staffer named Isaac who was taking night courses in accounting. She simply paid attention because people were worth paying attention to. The friction stopped by the end of the second week. Sybil escalated. She came into the east sitting room on a Tuesday morning with the specific positioning of someone who had arranged the conversation in advance. Seated with her back to the window, so Leona would be the one facing the light. "You've been here 2 weeks," Sybil said. "You've made the staff comfortable with you. That's an impressive tactic." "I wasn't being tactical." "Of course you were." Her voice was completely even. "Everything you do is a tactic. You observe before you move. You don't push anything you're not ready to push. You came here with a plan you haven't told anyone." A pause. "What I want to know is what that plan is." Leona looked at her steadily. "I needed to be somewhere Douglas Mercer couldn't reach me without cost." "That's partially true." "True enough." Sybil studied her. "My brother is not an instrument. Whatever position you think you're building, Wolfe's interests are not something I will allow to be used." "I'm not using him." "Not yet." Sybil stood. "I grew up watching people come through this house with agendas. Some were honest about it. You're the first one who's made me believe you're actually capable of something, which is exactly what makes you the most dangerous thing to walk through that door." She left. Leona went upstairs to check on Otto, who was building a complicated structure out of blocks on their floor, and explaining its structural logic to Gerald with considerable seriousness. She sat on the edge of the bed and watched him. She thought about her mother's letter. She thought about the 4 pages of careful, frightened handwriting and what Theda had been trying to tell her. She thought about the hospital records she'd been requesting for 3 years, and the specific kind of bureaucratic wall that appeared around certain documents when the right kind of money wanted them to stay buried. She was done being patient with walls. It was Cordelia Harrington who changed everything. Wolfe's grandmother occupied a suite in the east wing that felt, unlike the rest of the house, genuinely inhabited, books with cracked spines, a needlepoint she'd apparently been working on for 20 years, a chair by the window with the specific indent of long occupation. She had summoned Leona on the 3rd Thursday with a brief note delivered by Isaac, and Leona went because Cordelia was 81 years old and had the kind of eyes that told you the polite response was to show up. Otto had charmed her in approximately 4 minutes. He'd asked about the needlepoint. She'd explained the pattern. He'd said it looked like a map to somewhere. And something in Cordelia's face settled in a way Leona recognized. the settling of a woman who had been in rooms full of people performing interest for decades and had just encountered something that wasn't performing. "You can bring him whenever you like," Cordelia told Leona after Isaac had taken Otto to see the greenhouse. "He's good company." "He is," Leona agreed. Cordelia looked at her with the assessment of a woman who had been making judgments about people for 8 decades and had learned to make them quickly and accurately. "I knew about your mother's situation. Not everything, but enough." Theda Voss worked for the Mercers for 9 years, and nobody withstanding asked what that cost her. A pause. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me directly, because I'm too old for anything else." "All right. What do you intend to do?" The room was quiet for a moment. Leona thought about every version of this answer she'd rehearsed and discarded over 3 years, all the careful partial truths and strategic redirections. She looked at Cordelia's direct, patient eyes and found she didn't want to use any of them. "I intend to take everything from them that they took from her," she said. "Legally, methodically, with documentation she started building before she died, and that I've been continuing ever since. And I intend to do it without compromising anyone in this house who doesn't deserve to be compromised." Cordelia was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood and moved to a locked cabinet in the corner of the room. She produced a key from the chain around her neck, opened it, and from inside withdrew a folder with the particular quality of something kept carefully for a long time. The Mercer Group and the Harrington organization had a business partnership that ended abruptly 14 years ago, Cordelia said. The official reason was a contract dispute. The actual reason, she set the folder on the table between them, is in here. Leona opened it. By the 3rd page, her hands had gone cold. Financial records, transfer authorizations, account movements that didn't correspond to any legitimate billing cycle, and Millicent Mercer's signature on a diversion authorization dated 13 years ago, money pulled from the Harrington partnership, rerouted through a subsidiary, pocketed. "Millicent has been stealing from the Harrington organization," Leona said. The words came out level, despite what was assembling in her chest. "For approximately 6 years before I found these," Cordelia sat. "I kept them because I believed there would come a time when they would be more useful than they would have been if I'd used them at the point of discovery." She looked at Leona. "I believe that time is now." She told Wolfe that evening. His office was functional in the way of rooms where people actually worked. Documents, 2 monitors, nothing decorative. She laid Cordelia's folder on his desk and stood across from him while he read every page. When he finished, he squared the papers and set them down. "Millicent Mercer has been diverting funds from Harrington accounts." "For 6 years, yes." His jaw shifted. "How long have you been building the other case? The one about your mother?" 3 years formally, informally, since I was 20. He looked at her. What happened to her wasn't an accident. It wasn't a question. She could see he'd arrived at it himself, in the few minutes he'd been sitting with the documents. "I don't have proof that holds yet," she said. "What I have is documentation that Millicent was moving money through a partnership your family was part of. Evidence that my mother had discovered it and was building a case before she died. And the specific quality of her death, a medication dosage that was wrong in a way that required someone to make a deliberate choice, and a doctor who treated her and who has been unreachable for 12 years. A doctor you've located." She paused. 6 months ago, yes. Wolfe leaned back. "What do you need?" She hadn't expected him to say it quite that directly. She'd expected friction first, some form of caution to perform before commitment. "I need to meet with him. I need to get whatever he has. And I need access to someone in the DA's office who isn't connected to Douglas's people." "The last one I can help with," Wolfe said. He looked at her across the desk with something in his expression that hadn't been there before. "Not warmth exactly, the precursor of it, but I need you to understand that when this becomes visible, they will respond. Douglas has connections in this city. Millicent has spent 12 years making sure certain questions never got asked. I know. You've thought through every step. I've thought through nothing else for 12 years. She held his gaze. My mother spent her last months afraid, and she pressed forward anyway, and she died. I have been patient. I am done being patient. Something settled in his face. He picked up his phone. I'm going with you to see the doctor. That's not non-negotiable. He said it without heat. A man who's been in hiding for 12 years because the woman he was helping turned up dead is not someone you approach without backup. He looked at her calmly. I have considerably more infrastructure for this kind of conversation than you do. She looked at him for a moment. All right. Dr. Henry Alton lived in a quiet apartment above a dry cleaner on the Upper East Side and looked like a man who had been waiting for something to go wrong for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to wait for something good. He looked at Leona when she came through the door with the specific expression of a person encountering something they'd been carrying in their mind for years and finding the reality of it more solid than expected. You have her eyes, he said. I know. He made coffee he hadn't asked if they wanted and brought it anyway, and they sat, and he told her about Theta. The meetings, the documentation she'd been building, payment records, diversion schedules, correspondence that showed Millicent had known the Harrington partnership was being used as a shell and had been the architect of the diversion, not just a beneficiary. The way Theta had grown afraid in the final weeks. The phone call she'd made 6 days before she died, telling him she'd been followed leaving work, and that she needed him to keep everything if something happened. The specific quality of the medication error, which Alton had flagged at the time and been quietly told to let go. I've had her documentation for 12 years, he said. He looked at the folder in his lap with the expression of a man putting down something heavy. She asked me to keep it for her daughter. She said the daughter deserved to know the truth eventually. His hands, Leona noticed, were not steady. She said she was sorry she couldn't protect her better. The room was very quiet. Leona did not let what was happening in her chest reach her face. Not here, not yet. I need everything, she said. Her voice was steady because she made it steady, and I may need you to make a formal statement. If there's a way to put this in front of someone who can actually do something with it, Alton said, then yes. He looked at Wolfe. If I'm protected. You'll be protected, Wolfe said, the way he said things he meant. The weeks that followed were the most careful of Leona's life, and careful in the specific way of things that happened in conference rooms and across documented financial trails rather than anywhere visible. She met with a DA's investigator named Hess on a Tuesday in a building downtown with bad coffee and good fluorescent lighting. Hess listened to 90 minutes of her presentation without interrupting, then looked at Alton's documentation and said, in the flat, professional tone of someone trained to understate the things that weren't understated, this is substantial. I know, Leona said. If we pursue this, it won't stay quiet. The Mercer Group has connections throughout this city. I know that, too. Hess looked at Wolfe, who was sitting to Leona's left and not performing anything. Then she appeared to make a decision based on something she saw in that stillness. I'll need time, and I'll need your doctor. He's prepared, Leona said. At home, she had started thinking of the Harrington estate as home without deciding to, and she'd noted that shift with the careful attention she gave to everything that surprised her. She and Wolfe talked every evening, not always about the case. They talked about the house, about Cordelia, about the city visible from the east sitting room windows. He told her once, without appearing to intend to, that he'd taken over the family's underground operations at 27 because his father died before the transfer was complete and he'd had no preparation for what that meant. How old were you when you understood what the family actually was? She asked. 15, he said, though I think I knew before that and was just deciding what to do about it. Same, she said. He looked at her. They sat with it between them. One evening, she came into the sitting room and found him on the floor with Otto, who was explaining the block structure he'd been refining for 2 weeks. Wolfe was listening with his full attention, the same complete stillness he brought to everything, but directed entirely at a 6-year-old describing structural load distribution in terms of making sure Gerald had a good castle. Wolfe said, "What happens if this section goes here instead?" Otto considered it seriously. He moved the block, tested it. "It falls," he said, "but slower." "Good," Wolfe said. "That's an important thing to know." Leona stood in the doorway and watched them. She felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel since she was 7 years old, hearing her mother's voice through the kitchen floor, bright and unhurried, singing to herself in the morning. Something she hadn't trusted herself to feel in a very long time. She told herself it was a variable she needed to monitor carefully. She was wrong about that. It was not a variable. It was a fact. Millicent Mercer was arrested on a Wednesday morning. Leona was at the clinic when Hess called to confirm. The fraud case had been built on Alton's documentation, on the records Cordelia had kept for 14 years, and on the paper trail Theda Voss had assembled in the last months of her life. Douglas had cooperated. Not willingly, not immediately, but the evidence had given him a choice between cooperating and facing charges himself. And Douglas had always been more afraid of consequences than he was capable of causing them. "The medical question," Leona said. Her voice was level. "The dosage records are consistent with deliberate administration," Hess said carefully. "Connecting Millicent specifically to the order is harder. We're not closing that line of inquiry." A pause, "But the fraud charges are solid." Leona said, "Thank you." She held the phone in her lap for a long time. Then she drove back to the estate. The Mercer Group shares, which she'd been quietly acquiring for 2 years through holding structures with no visible connection to her name, were nearly complete. Douglas, in the spiral of legal costs and the collateral damage of Millicent's arrest, had been selling faster than she'd projected. The last 3 acquisitions went through within a week. The final confirmation arrived on a Thursday afternoon. She went to find Wolfe. "It's done," she said, "all of it." He looked at her across his desk. "How does it feel?" She thought about it honestly. "Not the way I expected." She sat down across from him. "I thought it would feel clean, like something finished." She looked at her hands. "It just feels true," which is different. He was quiet for a moment. "What do you need right now?" She looked at him. "I need to go to my mother's grave, and I need—" She stopped. It was harder to say the next part. "I need you to come." He stood without hesitating. "I'll get Otto." The cemetery was quiet in the mid-afternoon. The grave had been restored months ago, the first thing she'd arranged after the wedding, before any other piece of the plan, because the stone had been weathered and the ground untended, and that was the thing she couldn't let stay wrong. She stood in front of it with Otto's hand in hers. He was holding Gerald with his free hand and looking at the stone with the serious, quiet expression he wore when he was thinking something he didn't have words for yet. "Is this where your mama is?" he asked. "Yes." He thought about it. "Does she know we fixed her stone?" "I think she does," Leona said. He nodded, satisfied with that, and leaned his head against her arm. Wolfe stood a few feet behind them. She could hear him breathing, the slow, steady quality of a man who knew how to be present without taking up space that wasn't his. After a while, he came to stand beside her. He looked at the stone for a long time. Then he said she kept documentation in the lining of her coat. She called a doctor from a payphone when she was scared. She built a case alone because she had no one to help her build it. Yes. Otto won't have to do anything alone. He said it to the stone, to her. His voice was not entirely steady. Not like that. Not ever. Leona looked at him, his profile against the late sky, the city noise behind them, the small solid weight of her son against her arm. She had spent 12 years building toward this. She had planned for resistance, for enemies, for systems designed to keep certain truths buried. She had not planned for a man who would stand at her mother's grave and make a promise she hadn't asked for, that she hadn't known she needed, that landed in her chest with the specific weight of something real. "Wolfe," she said. He looked at her. Thank you. It came out quiet, not performed, just true. He put his hand over hers where it rested at her side. His hand was warm in the cold afternoon air. He held it there without saying anything, because he understood, she'd come to understand he almost always understood, that there was nothing more to say. Otto looked up at them. He studied the configuration of the three of them for a moment with his 6-year-old's unfiltered attention. Then he looked back at the stone. Gerald says hi, he told it, very seriously. Leona laughed. The real kind, the involuntary kind, the kind that came from somewhere she'd kept locked for so long she'd almost forgotten it was there. She stood at her mother's grave in the afternoon light with her son and the man she hadn't expected, and she laughed, and it didn't solve anything, and it didn't erase 12 years, and it didn't bring Theda back. But it was real, and it was hers, and it was the first day in a long time that she felt both of those things at once. The Theda Voss Medical Fund was formally registered 6 weeks later. It would provide legal advocacy and emergency support for domestic workers and service employees facing institutional negligence, the kind of support that, if it had existed in a different form 12 years earlier, might have given Theda Voss options she'd never been offered. Leona sat at the head of the table at the fund's first board meeting with her mother's letter in the inside pocket of her jacket, not because she needed to read it, but because she'd decided it belonged in the room. Afterward, she stood on the sidewalk outside for a moment and let the ordinary noise of the city move through her. She thought about what it had taken to get here, the patience. The 12 years of watching and waiting and building something in the margins of her actual life, while the people who'd taken her mother from her moved through the world as though nothing had been taken at all. They knew now that part was done. She walked to the car. Wolfe was leaning against the door with his arms crossed, watching her come down the steps. When she reached him, he looked at her face with the specific attention she'd grown accustomed to, the kind that didn't miss anything and didn't need to say so, and said, "How was it?" "Good," she said, and then, because it was true and because she was done with every form of concealment, she said it again, "Really good." He opened the car door for her. Otto convinced Cordelia to let him replant the fountain garden. Oh no. She's delighted about it. Of course she is. She got in. The city moved past the window on the drive home, to the estate, to the house, with the fountain and the block structures, and the grandmother who'd kept 14 years of evidence in a locked cabinet because she'd believed the right person would come along eventually. Home. Leona had not let herself use that word easily in a very long time. Words like that had a cost she knew better than most. But she was done being careful about costs. She had paid what was owed and collected what was hers, and what was hers, finally, was this: a man beside her who had never needed her to be smaller, a son who told a stuffed rabbit the news about everything important, and somewhere behind them, a grave with clean stone that stood in the right light, and caught it, and held it, and did not let it go. Her mother had given her two things: the knowledge that quiet people see the most, and the belief that truth is worth documenting even when you're afraid. Leona had spent 12 years proving both were right. She wasn't finished yet.